How can you be more desirable and more hireable as a creative in the industry right now? Whether you're working freelance or you're trying to work for a company applying for jobs, the industry is tight right now. And those that are getting hired and getting clients are the ones that can offer more value. In my opinion, the number one way that web and UI designers can offer more value is by offering higher fidelity prototypes. Prototypes are the thing that allow people to experience the design before they go to production, before they go to code. And so if we can offer prototypes that are much more high fidelity, that are much better than just screen to screen, or even better than Smart Animate inside of something like Figma or Adobe XD, you will immediately be more valuable and be more hireable. So in this little two-part series, I'm gonna teach you how to make super high fidelity prototypes inside of one of my favorite prototyping tools called Protopie. Protopie, if you don't know, is my tool of choice when I wanna make these super high fidelity prototypes. And the reason is because it allows me to tap in to my device's native capabilities. So stick with me as we go through this two-part series and create super high fidelity prototypes inside of Protopie. All right, let's get started. And to do that, you're gonna need to create a free Protopie account and then download, install the local version of Protopie. So just head over to protopie.io, the link's down in the description, get yourself a free account. It will actually set up your cloud account as well, and that's where you can be uploading and connecting all of your work, which is super great. And then you'll have the local version of Protopie installed, which looks a little something like this. I got a bunch of files in there. You might have nothing. That's cool. We're gonna get started here by creating a new pie. And just go ahead and click new pie. And sure enough, there we are. We are inside of Protopie just like that. Now we need some files to bring over. I'm going to head over to Figma, and inside of Figma, I have the Protopie plugin installed. Now to do that, you just do it like you do with any other plugin inside of Figma. Get your plugins however you get them, but get it installed. It's free to install it. And once you do, you're gonna see that the Protopie plugin is really simplistic. It's gonna say, hey, select an artboard or a frame, and then you're going to export that as a scene. Now, this is important to note that inside of Protopie, screens are scenes, and I'll explain to you why that matters. But let's just go ahead and grab the first of one of our screens here, which is a home screen and a menu screen, or it's a home screen with a menu on it, and we're going to go ahead and export. Now, Protopie is going to do that work. It's going to bring everything over pixel perfect. You can see, I'll jump back over to Figma and zoom in, and I'll push this plugin over to the side there. You can see we had our menu over here, and I'll just drag that away, and we had some nice furniture stuff. We're building a home decor app with the menu, all of the layers. When I head over into Protopie, you can see we have all those same things. All the groups have been honored. I can move this entire menu out and to the right, and all the text is there, and everything is good. So it's brought everything over in pixel perfection. And now let's just talk a little bit about this Protopie interface that you're really looking at. Well, one thing we just talked about is the fact that screens equate to scenes, and you'll see that up in the top left-hand corner in Protopie. This is not an artboard type experience where you can have a canvas with lots of artboards like in Figma. Every scene holds one screen. That's why scenes and screens, get it? So we have our home screen here. I'm going to double click on that and just call it home without the menu attached. And below that, you have all of the different layers like our side menu and everything. Now to the top left, you have a lot of the different tools that you can use. For instance, you can import this way if you want as well, but you also have access to different types of media like image, video, audio, camera, Lottie. We're going to use some of that later. We also have shapes like rectangles, all that kind of good stuff. We can put in text or input fields, which we'll be doing in this series, as well as different types of containers. You have your standard container. All containers can be converted into scrolling or paging containers. You can also turn elements into components, which will allow you to work smarter, not harder. Of course, like we said, we have our design here in the center, but we have the star of the show, which is the trigger and response interface here on the right-hand side. So this is the place where we're actually going to start creating our detailed interactions. And over on the right-hand side, you have your contextual panel that is contextually relevant. It has all the contextually relevant elements depending on what you're clicking on, text or shapes or not even selecting anything at all. We actually have some options as well. So that is the layout here, and we're going to get going. So now that we've imported one, why don't we actually import a bunch of other screens as well? All right, so we've clicked import, and ProtoPie has brought over all of our screens. I'm just going to drag my menu down here, and you can see there it is. There's our home screen, our onboarding screen, our camera screen, settings, voice command, and voice response. I'm going to press Command S. I'm going to save this, and this brings up my ProtoPie cloud account. Where do I want to save this? Well, first I'm going to title this Decor app, and I have a personal space, but I also have a team account. So I'm just going to save this in my personal space. It doesn't really matter. These are different tiers or levels of account, but I'm just going to save this in my personal space. Go ahead and press save, and it's going to start saving it to ProtoPie Cloud, which is great. You want to go ahead and save everything to the cloud. That way you can access things really easily. You'll never lose it. And there's some really good options to not only, while we're using something like ProtoPie, to preview our design, which we could do by pressing preview, but we can also run it on our device. We can rerun it on that device, but those are a few of the options there. Okay, so let's go back up actually to let's find our onboarding screen. I'm just going to drag it over to the left, and we are going to get started. So again, we're going to do the initial boring stuff, which is not high fidelity. This is not the stuff that's going to bring you all of that value as a freelancer or as somebody who is applying for positions, but it's going to do that initial screen-to-screen stuff. I'm going to show you how easy it is, and in doing so, I'm going to teach you a really basic mental model you need to learn inside of ProtoPie, and that mental model is that you need to create objects, triggers, and responses. Everything inside of ProtoPie is an object. On your screen right here, you can see every single thing is an object. That means this image is an object, this button is an object, and those objects, if you want to interact with them, they need some sort of trigger. And by selecting an object and assigning a trigger, you'll then be able to dictate a response based off the trigger that's assigned to the object. I hope that makes sense. That's going to be really, really important as we go. Let me show you a real simple example of this. This button for us is a great trigger. We're going to want to trigger something when we actually tap on it. So why don't we come right over here with the button selected? Let's add a trigger. And we have all sorts of different triggers that we can use here. We have touch triggers, conditional ones, mouse, key input, and sensory triggers. But right now we're going to talk about a lot of these during this series. But for right now, why don't we do the most basic one, which is a tap trigger, just a single tap trigger. Now, as soon as we add that tap trigger, you can see we have some options over here. With that trigger selected, you can see as we're selecting it here, we can turn that trigger on and off, which is really great because this allows us to experiment with things. We could do a tap trigger. Maybe we don't like that. Let's create a different tap trigger and try that out. And we can flip these on and off. Now we have it turned on, and you can see that it's assigned to the button. And if we wanted to assign somewhere else, maybe we want this assigned for some reason to the status bar, we could do that. But for right now, we actually really like it being on the button. You can also just scroll down and find what you want, start typing. But this is a good thing to remember. You can also just create random triggers that are assigned to nothing, right? So I can create another trigger, like maybe a long press trigger. But see how it's highlighted in yellow? It's saying, hey, this thing's not complete. You haven't finished kind of setting this thing up. What's not complete about it? We come over here, it tells us you haven't selected which layer this trigger, which object is this trigger assigned to. So I'm going to delete it, and then I'm going to move back in, and you can see that you can also double click and name these things. So let's put, we could keep it as tap, or we could call it tap button. That's great. Another really cool thing to do is if you have multiple different triggers that are happening, for instance, let's say we want to long press the button, and what happens if we also want to fling the button? We could grab all of these and Command G or Control G and group them all together, and we could call these button interactions or something like that, and we can tuck those away. We can turn all of them on and off, or we can turn certain ones on and off. And so there's just a lot of control here on organizing and kind of managing all of your responses, your triggers, and your objects. So I'm going to ungroup all of those. I'm actually going to delete simply by selecting and deleting these. Let's work on that simple tap trigger that we have here, okay? We're going to tap with one finger. You can dictate how many fingers, very specific. But now we're going to do the next piece, which is give it a response. So hey, this object on, and we can move our panel over so we can see things a little bit more. But this object on tap, what do we want it to do? We still have the button selected. So we're going to want to now give it a response. These responses can be all sorts of things. We have move, scale, rotate, 3D rotate. We can change the opacity, color, and other attributes of this element. We can reorder them in the layer stack, which you can't do in design tools. So if this is the bottom and maybe we want it to jump the layer stack so it stays visible, we can reorder, we can scroll, we can jump, send, link, we can do stuff with inputs. Again, we can start playing back like audio or video, or open up our native camera. We can add some sort of like haptic feedback, like a vibrate, speak, listen. We can do all of these things. We even have conditionals, which we'll talk about in the second video. But for now, let's do the most basic, which is jump. We want on tap, we want to jump to another screen. It's going to say, hey, which scene do you want to jump to? I think we'd probably want to go to the home screen. And then we get your basic transition stuff. Do we want smart, fade, pop, slide in, slide out? Why don't we do a simple slide in and we'll go from right to left. No delay. We're all set here, looking really good. So now with that done, we can press preview and we can select our button. It's just going to slide it over. This is standard stuff, but why don't we go through really quickly and fast forward, and we will jump and link all of our screens. And you can see get started. Boom, that's going to open up our camera. That'll slide it back down. Okay, great. And now we need to get to our other links, which are hidden inside of our flyout menu. So why don't we go to our home, and we can see I have our flyout menu there. How do we get this flyout menu actually into our design? And you can see when I put it there and I press preview, it's showing up, right? I could actually kind of just click on settings, and we'll get there, right? But we need to figure out how to slide this thing in. Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add one of those triggers and responses. So what we want to do is, with our actual side menu selected here, I'm going to come over and I'm going to add a new trigger. This trigger is going to be the fling trigger. You can do this a couple of different ways, which is important to note in ProtoPie. There's a lot of different ways to do the same thing, but I'm going to show you some of my favorite ways to build out these interactions. I'm going to go ahead and use a fling trigger. A fling trigger is a little bit different than drag or pull because I can fling it and it'll come out with this kind of like natural delay, which is very common for sidebar menus like this. So I'm going to fling, and on fling, I want to move. And how far do I want to move it? Well, I probably want to put it's currently, it tells us by clicking on it, it's at -240. And so I want the left edge of it to meet up right here with the very left edge of my actual application. That's going to be me putting it at 0 because the x-axis starts at 0 and moves to the right. So we should be able to do that. Now here's going to be the problem. There's nowhere for me to drag or grab it. So how do I actually get a hold of this? The easiest way to do that is to come back and grab our item, and in our contextual menu down here at the bottom, we want to add what's called a touch area. And it's going to open up this extra little spot. So we could add something like 40 pixels. Now we just have this invisible touch area. Let's preview it. We're able to grab, drag, and it has that nice little delayed reaction. Let's try that again. So we'll just drag, and you see there's this tiny little delay. Now, if you want that transition to take a little bit longer, we're here on our fling and we're showing the move. Now we have the opportunity to choose easing, duration. Do we want a little bit of a delay? So we can change this to something a little bit springier, perhaps, like something like spring, and it'll give us a little preview of it. And that's a little bit too springy, I think. So we might bring the tension back so it's a little less, right? If you don't like that, you could do custom, and you can custom create your own. So that's nice. Now, another thing that's popped up, as soon as we've done that, you'll see, well, it's always been there, but now it's a little bit more noticeable. We actually have this awesome timeline. Now, what this means is that we can actually create multiple different responses on one trigger. Now, what's really cool is that those responses don't have to all be on the same thing. I'm going to introduce you to what's called a parent-child relationship. So the parent here is that we are using the trigger, we're sliding over, we're hitting that touch area. The response can be not only the menu itself, it can be any other item on the screen, which is absolutely bonkers. So for instance, on fling, we want our menu to move, but maybe we also want to grab all of our elements here, or maybe what we could actually do is make it a little bit easier is draw a rectangle, and we'll do a nice overlay and just make everything a little bit darker. So I'm going to choose to make this actually white. I'm going to drag it to the top. I'm going to put it as I drag it just right there underneath that menu. I'm going to call this overlay like that. I'm going to bring the opacity of it down to be something like, let's do 75% opacity. Actually, we'll bring it to 0 opacity for now. And what we want to do is with that overlay selected in our layers panel, we're going to add a new response. We're going to say, hey, we want you to change the opacity of this element. And we want that to be, let's see, the opacity is going to go up to 100%. See how it was yellow before, and now we moved it up, and it's saying, hey, move the opacity to, or we could move the opacity by a certain amount. Lots of options in the contextual panel. I'll leave those to you to explore for each element and type of trigger. But we are also now able to control in a timeline way. If we want to get real nitty gritty and granular, we can always do it over here, but we can also do it over here. We can say, hey, what's the duration of this? How about like 0.3 seconds? And then we don't actually want the menu to slide over until that has happened, right? So we're going to line those up like so. And what happens now when we actually fling over is it brought in our element, and we'll do it one more time. Brought in our element and brought the opacity of it up. Now that's set to 100. Let's bring it back down to something like 60. That's actually looking the way we want it to, right? The opacity goes up, and then the menu slides in. So I actually think I want my opacity to start and end at the same time. So this thing is taking in, like, my movement is probably going to happen in a total of 0.2 seconds, but because it's delayed, it's like it's not actually finishing until half of a second. So my opacity is going to gradually grow for that entire half of a second. A little bit smoother, a little bit nicer, okay? So we're going to hide our preview again. And now we also want to have a similar interaction, right? But instead of doing it on fling, we're going to want to do it on tap, okay? So what we're going to do is I'm going to grab my little menu icon here, and I'm going to lock this thing in place so I can actually start messing with the other elements underneath it. I'm going to grab my menu, I'm going to add a trigger there, and it's going to be on tap. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my move and my opacity, Command C, come right here, and I'm going to paste them inside. It's going to do the exact same thing because we just duplicated the exact same interaction. So you can see now when I click, I get the same exact thing as if when I do my fling. So now you can kind of see I can grab both of these elements, group them together, and call it side menu, and I can just tuck those away because I've organized them. That's exactly what I want them to do, right? Now let's do a little bit more with our side menu because we want fling. We want to be able to fling the other way. Did you notice that in the top right hand corner, we're flinging to the right to get that interaction? Well, we want to be able to put it away as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this. First, we're going to call this fling in, copy paste. I'm going to call this one fling out. And it's going to move it. Where is it going to move it to? It was initially, like right now, you can see it's at negative 240. Remember, that was our initial X value for its position before it animates in. So we're going to come back to our fling out. We're going to say, hey, we want you to move to negative 240 like that. All right, let's do that whole thing. And then opacity, we want this to, the opacity when we fling it out to go to 0. But it's very important that we change the direction of our fling, right? So now we should be able to preview. We should be able to fling in and fling out, which is really, really nice. And it's really important to note that, you know, when I'm flinging it in, I can grab from here and it's pulling it, but when I'm flinging out, I can grab anywhere on the actual menu itself as well. Now, if we wanted to, we can do another thing, right? This same tap movement that's happening here, we might want to do on our overlay. So let's set up another one and say tap anywhere on the overlay to send it back in. We can do that. So why don't we grab the same thing as this fling out? We're going to call this one tap in. We'll call this one tap out like so. Let's get our fling out because it's those same out movements, right? Copy them, paste them in, and now we should be able to tap anywhere. Once we've brought our menu in, we can tap out here on the overlay and it'll send it back out as well. Now we have multiple interactions with precision control and timeline animations for one simple interaction, but it's much more granular and it's much more detailed. All right, next up, let's work on that carousel that we had in our onboarding, and we'll actually create some nice pagination, and we'll actually chain and link together not only the images paginating, but the pagination dot down below. And then after we're done doing that, we're gonna upload everything to the cloud. We're actually gonna start handing things off to our developers, testing it inside of our devices, and then giving our developers like really fine-grained detailed code and timing for all those animations. All right, I have my onboarding screen here, and you'll notice that inside of Figma, I had 3 of these images, and they were expanding beyond the containment area or the confines of the frame. And you can kind of see that happening here as well. Our button has a tap trigger on it that actually jumps us to a new screen. So that's great. But now we want to paginate these things. We want to be able to scroll through them. So I'm going to hover over this guy, and I'm going to see that it's about 65 pixels away by holding down the Option key and kind of hovering over elements. I want this one to be about the same, 65. So we're 8. Now we're about 65 pixels away, but I want these to be in some sort of container or group. So I'm going to actually grab a container, the hotkey is N, and I'm going to draw that container around my my pagination images like this. And I'm going to make sure it's tight all the way to the left and right hand edge. It's also tight to the image itself. Now that container you can see here, I'm going to call this pagination in my layers panel, and I'm going to make sure that my images, my 3 images here, you have image 1, 2, and 3, are inside of that pagination. And you can see that the container is actually only the width of my device, which I'm currently using iPhone 11 Pro. That's 375 by 812. Do you know there's all sorts of other device sizes and types you can do inside of ProtoPie? So we can do iOS, Android, desktop, or even make up your own. So maybe you want to have some sort of awesome dashboard like car interface, or maybe like a tonal like workout screen that's like mounted on the wall. You can do any size that you want inside of ProtoPie, which is really, really awesome. But I'm using 375 by 812, therefore my container is 375, okay, naturally. Okay, now we want to be able to actually paginate back and forth, and there's a lot of different ways you can do this. We don't need to be really, really complex. We need to be pretty simple here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my basic container that I've created into a different type of container. We have scrolling containers, and we can tell it, hey, which direction do we want to scroll? Now when I preview, I can scroll this way. But we get kind of that standard Figma thing where we can roll through at whatever kind of size or at whatever speed we want. There's nothing really native like to the device. It doesn't really feel native to the device. So instead, what we might want to do is turn this into a paging container, right? When we turn into a paging container, we can actually page by the container itself or custom width. We can add bounce or not, and we can decide how we want it to page, up, down, or left or right. Let's just try this with those settings on there, and you can see, let's put it back in our preview back in the middle here. We get this nice paging experience where it actually stops right at each one of them because we're actually paginating. That's the point of it. But we get this ugly spot right here where it's kind of rubbing up to the side. Now in Figma or other prototyping tools, what you might want to do is like manipulate the size of the container, or we have to put some sort of invisible element at the end so it spaces properly. We don't have to do that in ProtoPie. All we have to do is come down. We have to know the width of our actual screen, which is 375, right? And we just come down and we say, hey, instead of scrolling or paginating by the container, we want it to be custom, and that custom size is 375. So now when I paginate and kind of scroll through this thing, you can see I'm just dragging over, and it's always going to center my image or my objects in the center of that 375. And so we've done the work to make it like just paginate back and forth. You also get that native over scroll and springiness there, which is really, really nice. So now our pagination looks really, really great. But the problem is our little pagination dots aren't working. Well, remember how in one of our previous examples, we had a parent-child relationship. We're going to do that as well for our pagination and our pagination indicators using something called a chain trigger. And so what we're going to do is let's hide our preview, and I'm going to say, hey, as we are paginating through this bad boy, I want to add a trigger here, and I want it to be a chain trigger. All right. So I want that chain trigger, like as I do this, I want it to chain something else to happen as well. And what that chain trigger is going to be is the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my active dot. You can see we have 1, 2, 3 dots, and then we have the selected or the active state. So I'm going to grab that thing and I'm going to say, hey, I want you to respond. I want you to move. So as soon as we do that, it's going to bring this movement up. It's going to start mapping a range of movement for us because we're chaining one movement to another movement. So we're going to say, hey, that pagination here goes from 0 to what? 375. When we're at 375, we want to now mess with the X and the Y values of that little pagination dot. See how we've selected the pagination dot? All right, so how far away is our pagination dot from the next spot? It's currently sitting at a position of 0. Why? Because it's also in a parent-child relationship with the container or the group that it's in. See how it is inside of this dots container. The dots container is at a position of 164, but the active or all the dots inside of it are relative to the parent container that it's in, right? So it's currently sitting all the way left of the container. It's at 0. We want to move it to sit here over the next dot. What's that spot? That's 20 pixels. So it's moving 20 pixels at a time to get in between those different inactive states. So let's move this back, put it where it belongs, and let's go back to our move trigger. We're going to say, hey, when it's at 0, I want you to be at 0. But when it's at 375, when it's paginated over 375 whole pixels, I want you to move 20 pixels to the right. So remember, this is the range of the thing that you're working with, the master item, and then it's chaining to your supporting item. Does that make sense? I hope it does. All right, so as we try to sample our project, we're paginating and nothing is happening. And the reason is because on our chain, we can actually dictate what we want to chain it to. Not the X value of this, we actually want to chain it to the scroll value of our paginating images container, right? Now when we press preview, we can see as we scroll over, our dot goes back and forth, and we get it both ways. We don't have to set up multiple interactions to go left and right. We just set it up to go between these two ranges. Now, the problem is when we go to the right again, there was no range set up for it. So we're going to have to fix that. And that's really, really easy to do. We're going to come back into that move. And look, we got a nice little plus button here. So we're going to say, hey, when you go from 375 to what's 375 times 2? That's actually 750. When you go between the range of image 2 and 3, as you start making that move, we want you to go from where you're currently at of 20, and we want you to go up to 40. Okay, great. Let's press preview again. We'll scroll in so we can kind of see it, and we can see we're going from that first range, and that second range kicks in, and now we have linked some really, really cool like dynamic stuff that's happening. And again, this isn't the end. You can add way more things happening as this is paginating. You want to change the opacity of the item? You can do that. You want to change the 3D rotation of the item? You can do that. You want to change active, inactive states of any other element on your screen? You can do that too, which is really, really rad. All right, the last thing we're going to do in this video is upload everything to the cloud, and then we're going to explore it in the cloud and get ready for handoff because maybe we love our interactions. We love everything about this. I'm going to hit Command S or Control S depending on your operating system, and that's going to save it to the cloud, and you can see it's given me a link right here, or we can copy that link and drop it in an email. But I'm going to go ahead and click on that link, and it's going to go ahead and open up my Pi, my prototype, inside of the cloud. Now, you got a bunch of options here. Of course, we can restart our prototype. We can view the options. Do we want to take the device frame off? You can see that's happening right there. Do we want to take off the ProtoPie UI, change the cursor type? Lots of stuff going on there. We can comment as well, and we can share this with people, right? So we can actually get a QR code, which is really, really great. All right, so we can grab that QR code using the actual ProtoPie viewer application that's free to download. Once we're here, all we have to do is scan, and we get our camera pops up, and it's gonna allow us to actually scan the QR code that's on the screen. So let's do that now. I'm gonna scan the QR code. It feels totally native inside of my device, right? So I can scroll back and forth between all of it. You see the pagination working. I'm gonna press get started, and I have the ability to fling my menu open and fling it back. And it all feels really, really good. It feels very, very native. Now from here, we're going to do some really cool stuff. We can share it to our team, copy the link and the QR code if we want to. But another great thing that we get to share is what's called recordings. I'm going to go up here to the top left and click this item called handoff. When I do that, I get something that tells me we're going to record the interactions to handoff specs. Now this is something that's very hard to do because handing off interaction times and the code that goes with that interaction is just not something you can normally get, but we get that here inside of ProtoPie. So I'm going to go ahead and record. You can see we are now officially recording. Let's move to this screen, and I'm actually going to go ahead and tap, and we get it happening there. I'm going to click, and this time I'm going to fling, and I'm going to fling, and then I'm going to press stop. And when we do that, we get much more complex details that are happening here, right? So you can click through and see the transition. That's the transition from screen to screen. But now we get to see the actual transition of our menu, right? So it's telling our developers, hey, on tap, number of fingers 1. It's a tapping of the menu icon. Here's all the details of it, right? What's going to happen? Oh, well, the opacity overlay is changing. Here's the delay, the duration, the easing. This is all code-ready stuff that we're looking at here, and all the layer properties. And you get to look at all of the other stuff too, as well as being able to play this back in half time if they want and loop through it and see all of these interactions. They no longer do our developers have to guess about all of this handoff stuff. We don't, as designers, have to describe our interactions like, hey, developer, it's kind of like, shh. It kind of moves out like that, shh, maybe like half a second. Instead, we get to actually just show our development team and hand them the code, and we can copy this link directly and send them a link straight to this recording if we want. Well, that's it for our first video. We are barely scratching the surface of what ProtoPie can do, and I think you can tell that the sky is the limit inside of ProtoPie. If you can dream it, if you can imagine it, you can make it super high fidelity, dynamic, and interactive using this tool. Stick around for the second video in the series because we're going to do even more dynamic and interesting things for our project inside of ProtoPie, like form validation, using the native camera, and a whole bunch of other fun stuff, so stick around. And if you haven't already, make sure you sign up for a free ProtoPie account. The link is down in the description. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure you leave a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell notification icon so you know when the next video in this series and other videos come out. I hope you're having an amazing week. I hope you're designing amazing things, making amazing things, and I hope you're growing your value as a creative. We'll see you in the next one.